Now, the Environment Protection Minister, Peter Garrett, slamming the opposition's plan to cut the carbon capture program. This is all on the backdrop of opposition leader Tony Abbott announcing that he would axe the government's $300 million Carbon Institute, designed to develop technology to help combat climate change. Let's get more on this with our technology reporter, Helen Frost, with me in studio. This institute, Helen, what's really at the heart of it?
Well, basically it aims to develop technology for capturing and then storing carbon emissions from the coal industry specifically. And while it's been widely agreed that you can actually develop this technology, it's just really expensive to put it into place. So there's been a little bit of a controversy, I suppose, over how much money should be spent on it. But the Coal Association has already come out saying it is absolutely vital to its industry. So it's now about seeing whether or not the program can actually go ahead and whether we can actually see this technology developed and then implemented with our miners. For more on this story and also how other industry sectors are using technology to rein in their costs as well as their meeting their global environment, I suppose, commitments, I've got Chris Rixon with me from BMC Software. Welcome, Chris.
Morning.
So how does this type of carbon capture program work? Does it capture the emissions from the coal or...?
Yeah, so carbon capture is a technology that allows you to extract carbon dioxide from the output of a power station or whatever your power generation device is and literally sequester it and take it away, of course. However, that's very easy to say and not so easy to do, and particularly when it relates to technology like brown coal, which is inherently dirtier and harder to clean up. We're not quite there yet.
Okay, so how does green IT then fit in with the United Nations view of goal of companies taking on responsibility for their carbon footprint and responsibility of what they're going to do in the future, so making sure that they have methods in place now to combat what's going to happen in 10, 20 years?
Right, so there's really two components to that. The first component is a recognition of the fact that ICT is a major contributor to CO2 emissions. You know, here in Australia, something like 14.5 megatons of CO2 is generated by ICT usage. So for every employee in an Australian business, on average, is generating 3/4 of a tonne just from the ICT infrastructure they use. So there's a recognition from the UN and many other bodies that we need to be very, very careful and start reduction of those emissions by greater use and more efficient use of technology. The other side of that is the use of technology in and of itself as a green enabler. So better power transmission systems, better power monitoring technologies, supply chain optimization. The thinking is that that's probably 5 or 6 times, it's going to offset carbon 5 or 6 times more than the actual ICT consumes. So very interesting.
So how does Australia then compare with other regions, and what sectors within Australia are actually coming on board for this challenge?
So it's really interesting. Australia, for whatever reason, is quite a way ahead in terms of understanding what the problem is. So some fascinating research coming out of Australia that really tightly defines how much energy usage is from ICT, breaks it down by industry sector, by user type, by technology type, and that's unique in the world, that understanding and analysis of how much CO2 is generated. In terms of the industry sectors, the number one is the telecoms infrastructure. And what you tend to find is those industries for whom technology is core. There's a lot of, they're dependent on the technology, there's a lot of it, and therefore any reduction you can make is that much bigger because of the propensity to use so much technology. Hotly pursued by education and training, actually. So the public sector doesn't get away with this. There's a huge amount of ICT in the public sector.
Okay. This idea, though, of sequestration and all of that, without getting bound up in the lingo and all of what it really means, is it fair to say that that isn't actually recognised as an offset? This is not something that you can, at least from the government's point of view, it's not part of a carbon footprint offset. It's not acknowledged to be identified as that.
No, that's right, and mainly because the technology to do it isn't there yet. There's a lot of talk around sequestration from carbon capture, but no one has, on any scale, has really pulled that off. There's also a lot of question marks over offsetting as a, how effective that really is anyway. You're much better off, and most of the customers we work with have identified actually we're better reducing the amount of IT infrastructure we're dependent on and switching things off, because that is definitive, right? It's no longer consuming power, it's no longer emitting CO2.
So if we look at compliance within industries around green IT, what are the biggest issues that are facing? Because compliance and regulation can be quite a daunting prospect for some people looking to embark on this type of project.
You know, it's interesting because here in Australia you are somewhat ahead in terms of looking at the efficiency of buildings, including data centres, and actually having to make public statements about how much CO2 is output by ICT and other technologies. So clearly, in order to do that, you need to have an understanding of what it is you have deployed and how much electricity it's pulling, and therefore what the equivalent CO2 emissions are. So you have to have a really good baseline of what you've got deployed. How hard does it work? Who uses it? Does anybody use it? Could you power it off? So building an accurate and rich inventory of technology is something we get involved in quite a lot. And that then enables you to make a bunch of decisions. You can respond to an audit very quickly because you've automatically captured what's deployed and how hard it works. But then you start to identify candidates for switching things off or moving to virtualization. Perhaps I could consolidate those 200 servers down to 10. And therefore enjoy a 90% reduction in CO2.
So people can sort of have an idea of what a data centre is and how big it is. For New South Wales or
Sure.
Australia, how big is it and how much electricity are we looking at consuming?
You know, that's an excellent question because a lot of people do not have an instinctive feel for how power hungry a data centre is. So put it in context for you. Let's say an average, a large company here in Australia may have 2 or 3 data centres, each of which is consuming megawatts of power, and it's 24/7. You know, it's not like kettles going on and off. You're talking megawatts, 24/7. That's like a suburb of Sydney for each data centre, and depending on how the power is generated, because that's critical, then obviously that has a material impact on how much CO2 is actually being generated.
What makes you so certain that if companies cut their electricity usage, therefore there's less demand on the system, that the actual utility companies won't just raise their prices? They're going to be getting less revenue. It's going to sting you for using less. They will always win, and they're doing this already.
Well, it's interesting because the rising cost of energy has actually been a driver for the uptake of green IT, because you can use the word green interchangeably with efficiency, right? So what it really means is, can I sweat my existing infrastructure more? Power prices are climbing. Raw material inputs are climbing, so power prices are climbing. Everything I can do to shave every watt off my electricity is going to have a material impact on my costs.
But will it still have that material impact if the utility companies, irrespective of you cutting, work against that and raise their prices? There's nothing to stop them. There's nothing the government can really do to solve that.
Well, I actually think that fuels even more interest in efficient computing, actually. The higher those prices climb, the more organisations are going to look at, well, how much less can I get away with? So it's a bit of a virtuous circle in that respect. And it also throws into sharp relief the difference between the motivation behind green IT, which is largely environmental conscious, versus the justification, which is almost always a cost basis.
Yeah, bottom line.
Talking about cost, what is the ROI you're looking at? Can you measure it?
You can. You really can. It's interesting because, like I said before, the word green is interchangeable with efficiency, and therefore, here in Australia, that typically you will find organisations who are looking to reduce something like 50% of their physical IT infrastructure. And that has a direct correlation to the amount of power that you reduce by, and therefore the amount of CO2. So what you will typically find then is if you're able to remove 50% of that infrastructure, that can translate into millions of dollars in terms of power and cooling, and that can have a material impact on the fundamentals of a company.
We're unfortunately going to have to leave it there. Chris Rixon from BMC Software, thanks so much.
Okay.
Helen Frost, as always. Great to have you both with us.